Hello, I'm Mike Lewis, the managing editor of Where Peter Is and the host of the Peters Field Hospital podcast. This is part 2 of my discussion with David Lafferty and Nathan Turowsky about the influence of leaders like Archbishop Viganò and Taylor Marshall on ordinary Catholics. In part 1, we discussed the influence of the QAnon conspiracy theory on Archbishop Viganò's recent letter-writing campaign. In part 2, we talk about the extremes that this kind of rhetoric has reached, the disturbing impact of these messages on ordinary Catholics, and what we can do to reverse this trend. As always, we would like to thank our Patreon sponsors, especially Lisa, Chris, and Stephen. If you would like to support Where Peter Is, please visit wherepeteris.com and click on the Patreon button on the right-hand column of the page. We hope you enjoy part 2 of the podcast. The thing that really gets me is my mouth is just my jaw has been open for probably the last 6 or 7 Viganò letters when Cardinal Burke started talking about microchips and government tracking. It's amazing to me that these figures are allowed to continue without any pushback. I mean, honestly, when Cardinal Burke openly requested in 2017 for the reconsecration, of course, in his mind, the actual consecration of Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart as Our Lady requested at Fatima. I thought that was the Rubicon, because I thought that faithful Catholics, the great majority of them in the U.S., support Pope John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict, even if they don't support Pope Francis. I thought he had crossed a line. But boy, has he blown past that line and then started talking about apostasy and suggesting that the full third secret wasn't revealed, and has bought into a lot of these one world conspiracy theories. Nathan, I've described this as post-reality. I've heard a lot of people talk about our culture as post-truth. Like you were saying earlier, you're shocked at the number of your peers, the number of Catholics, especially young adult converts, who are just buying into this stuff. How deep do you think all of this goes, and where do you think it leads?
I have a hard time envisioning any endpoint to this process other than some kind of formal schism at some point. I think the only reason there hasn't been some sort of public excommunication or schism or something yet is that we are living in a post-truth, post-reality environment where the fact that there are millions of people who think that they are literally more Catholic than the Pope is just something we've all agreed to accept or ignore or not point out as strange anymore. I think eventually the other shoe is going to drop and it's going to become clear to people that there's no way for the institution of the papacy to coexist with a significant constituency of Catholics that think that the Pope is an evil Democrat, baby-eating heretic. I think the whole post-truth and post-reality we just agreed to live in this utterly absurd situation because it would be too awkward to point out how ridiculous it is. The post-truth, post-reality series of points or catchphrases or whatever is apt here. And I just don't see any way out of the mire of millions and millions of especially American Catholics, genuinely believing and being told by prominent clergy that they are literally more Catholic than the Pope. I just don't see any way out of that other than some sort of breaking point.
And I think one of the reasons, perhaps, why Pope Francis hasn't actually taken any formal action, well, I consider two possibilities. One, he and those around him might underestimate the depth of this problem. They may not realize how many priests are preaching this from the pulpit, discussing this among themselves, how widespread it is at seminaries. And frankly, although not a lot of them are public about it, I have a feeling there is a significant minority of US Catholic bishops who are to some degree on board with this line of thinking. The other possibility is that he might be aware of it, but he knows at this point that they're not gonna listen to any kind of disciplinary action. They're not gonna recognize any kind of excommunication or declaration that they've gone outside of communion. In Robert Fastigi's piece that he wrote for us this past weekend, even though he, from his theological perspective, totally sees Viganò as materially schismatic, he doesn't recommend that Pope Francis take any action. To be frank, if anybody is buying in to what Viganò is saying, at least in my opinion, they will not recognize or respond in a good way to any action that's taken against him, because what he's saying is so far off the wall that any acknowledgement on the part of Francis, I think, might push things in that direction. Do you see any antidote, or what are your feelings about why there hasn't been a response?
Well, first of all, I think that what you just described is another post truth thing. This denial of basic reality, the fact that we can seriously be talking about denials of reality to the extent of people not just thinking they were unjustly excommunicated, but thinking they haven't been excommunicated when they have. Yeah, my guess is essentially what you said. I think that either Pope Francis is still believes or is still being told that this is a small vocal group of troublemakers who he can basically just benignly ignore, or he knows otherwise now and is just not taking any actions that would further embolden them or further escalate towards formal schism. I'm not beating the drum for schism. I think that at some point some sort of parting of the ways is inevitable, but I'm not happy about that. And I think that Pope Francis is well within his rights to try to avoid that if at all possible. I'm just not sure how successful in the long run I think that strategy can possibly be at this point.
I think it surprises a lot of people, myself included, to see that a schism against the Pope is materializing on the right. Now, I know that there are a lot of people in Catholic media who are on the right, and they're telling us to divert our attention to the German synodal way. Even though I grew up in a reactionary conservative Catholic family, I went to an extremely liberal Catholic high school. So for me to hear that there are liberal Catholics out there who want women's ordination and want gay marriage and want other aspects of the so-called progressive or liberal agenda is like reporting to me that water is wet. I almost shrug my shoulders at that. There's nothing new. People say to me, why don't you attack the left the way that you do the right? Well, what I'm seeing from the left is that people are basically pouring out of the church at alarming rates. On the right, they might claim that they're more Catholic than the Pope. People may dissent from Catholic teaching. They may hate the Pope. They might claim that they speak for the church and the magisterium doesn't, although they'll claim that what they are speaking is the magisterium. But what I notice is they're not going anywhere. Even when action is taken against them, when Archbishop Lefebvre and the 4 bishops that he consecrated were excommunicated, they denied the legitimacy of that excommunication. The priests of the SSPX are suspended and have no faculties in the church, yet they claim that that's invalid. They're not going anywhere. They're going to claim to be the best Catholics in the world. Whereas what I'm seeing on the left and from people in this culture is that a lot of them are hanging by a thread, and they've got one foot out the door and hammering home some moral doctrine that's not going to bring them back. That's just going to send them away to never return. David, you've written about this synodal way in Germany and the one that's coming up in Australia, and we don't have to go through that whole thing. But let me run this idea by you. I think that a lot of Pope Francis's strategy is directed towards a rapidly secularizing society that is very quickly losing its connection to the Catholic faith. And I think a lot of Catholics on the right don't, they almost have the elder brother syndrome from the prodigal son parable, where they've stuck with it the whole time, and here is Pope Francis making this big deal out of these liberal leaders or these young people who aren't very orthodox or is being tolerant of priests and bishops who dissent from Catholic moral teachings. But I think his approach is what's necessary, and I think that committed Catholics who are really committed to thinking with the church, would be better off if they aligned themselves with Pope Francis and his mission of evangelization of those in the culture who are tempted to walk away from the church. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's a very different dynamic when we're looking at the progressive wing of the church versus the sort of reactionary or traditionalist wing. I think, I mean, we're so used to hearing from the more traditionalist Catholics and, complaining that the faith has been so watered down and all this kind of stuff. But the perception from progressive Catholics has been quite the opposite. They're kind of thinking that there's a lot of potential from the Second Vatican Council that was never fulfilled, right? Because there were forces within the church that kind of stopped progress from happening, right? And you saw that with, they're especially, they had a big problem with Ratzinger or Pope Benedict and the way that he sort of, clamped down on progressive theologians and that sort of thing. And so they've gone through this long period where they said, we really wish the church would go further. We really wish the church would make more progress. But they kind of got through the John Paul II and Pope Benedict years. And then in the midst of that, when they were, thinking they were being patient, then the abuse crisis breaks out. And I think you can't underestimate how incredibly traumatic that has been for, all kinds of Catholics, but especially those who stuck with the church despite Humanae Vitae, who stuck with the church despite the church's teachings on, homosexuality as objectively disordered and all that sort of thing. Then to see the church just sort of disintegrate into sexual corruption, within its own ranks, it just seemed like the ultimate in hypocrisy. So I think on the progressive wing, what we're seeing is, people who want now, they're saying either we get that progress that we were sort of promised at Vatican II, or it's done for us. There's a lot of people who, like you said, I think they're hanging on by a thread. And on the one hand, I don't think we should be quick to water down the faith, and I don't think that Pope Francis is big on that either. But I think he really wants to reach out to those people. He doesn't want to let those people go, and I think that's very important too. The people who we sometimes look down upon as cafeteria Catholics, I don't think we want to let those people go, because again, it's a huge part of the church, a part of the church who's, stuck with the church despite it being sort of at odds with the way that they would sort of prefer to live their lives, right? So it's just a very different dynamic. But what I appreciate, I guess, about the sort of progressive side of things is that, I mean, this is happening in a very sort of transparent way. I mean, whatever you want to say about the synodal way, it's extremely transparent. They publish everything that they do. Now it's mainly in German, but you can get it translated pretty easily. All the discussions they're having, everything, it's all put up there. And when you actually read through it, it's not quite as radical as it sounds when it's talked about on LifeSite News or even in National Catholic Register or CNA. It's often much more nuanced, right? Like, so there's not. They want more maybe openness. They don't want an actual sort of break with church teaching in a lot of cases, or they'll talk about bringing women into the church. I think very few of them actually want female priests, let's say. Some are for female deacons. Many are for just greater female participation in the church in general. So we have to make those kind of subtle distinctions. But what I've found most disconcerting about the sort of traditionalist uprising is, for one, it goes against that spirit of openness of the Second Vatican Council and the spirit of openness that Pope Francis has been putting forward. And in some cases, it just completely rejects the Second Vatican Council. Like Viganò, in his piece that he published after this Trump letter, talking about I think that's the one where he talks about the post-Vatican II neo-church, or this kind of monstrosity that's not the real church. So they're actually far, far more radical. They're far coming at things from if we want to talk about radicality, it's the people like Viganò who are by far the most radical and who are taking the biggest leaps towards schism. And they're doing it, again, not in a sort of transparent way. They're doing it through these sort of staged media interventions. And, like Viganò's in hiding. You have basically people testing, seeing how far they can go, how much they can get away with, how much they can kind of push against Pope Francis and the sort of post-Vatican II church without being, excommunicated or disciplined or whatever. And to me, it just seems it's fundamentally dishonest. It's that kind of working against the Pope where you're really trying to stab him in the back. And I think that's the thing that has to stop. At least in Germany, they're doing it in full sight of everybody, and we can all critique it. And I think we should critique it. But at least it's there, and they're listening, and it's all under the eyes of the church.
Nathan, I was just thinking about some of what David said and seeing if you agree. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this seems like a rehash of the post-Vatican II traditionalist reaction. And there's a big part of me that thinks that this only leads down one road. I think one thing that we've noticed is that since this resistance to Pope Francis began, each of these anti-Francis voices, leaders, has adopted even more radical positions. They've gone from finding Pope Francis a little concerning or troubling to openly disagreeing with some of his teachings to declaring that he's a heretic. Now we have people who are denying his authority. Taylor Marshall has embraced the SSPX to a large degree. Viganò theologically seems to be in schism from the Pope. I mean, part of me wonders why they don't just rip off the Band-Aid and declare themselves all sedevacantists, or call for a new conclave and conclave of one, I guess, and elect Cardinal Burke Pope. I think part of it is because they want to hold on to what they have institutionally, especially those who do rely on the institutional church. But I guess one thing that you said was you don't really see a reversal. How much lower do you think it can get?
I don't know if I can answer that question, because if you had asked me even a year ago, I don't know that I would have thought it was possible for it to get as low as it is now.
Yeah, the funny thing is back in 2018, I wrote a piece about how a lot of these people are conspiracy theorists, and I took a quote from Bishop Schneider and a quote from Cardinal Burke talking about the consecration of Russia, and a
Mhm.
quote from Cardinal Seurat. And
Mhm.
now that I look back at those, it's almost quaint to think of what I thought of as an off the wall conspiracy theory from where we were then to where we are now.
Viganò, I think, is a cornucopia of crazy, even compared to Burke, even compared to Schneider, certainly compared to Seurat, who, even though he's gotten out to no good in the past few months, I still feel kind of at least a half step above the rest. Yeah, I don't know how much worse I think it can get. What I would expect is, in the immediate future, a situation where these people are saying plainly sedevacantist things, where they're just plainly I mean, we're already seeing this in Viganò's the second of the two V drops of the past few weeks, where if you will, where Viganò refers to Francis as neo eletto in 2013 in scare quotes, the newly elected. It's like Viganò is Chief Wiggum in that old Simpsons joke. Watch me wink as I speak. When Pope wink Francis was elected, wink wink. I think we'll be seeing more of that. I think eventually they're going to start just consistently speaking and behaving as if they don't believe that there is a valid incumbent pope. I think there might be a breaking point whenever Pope Emeritus Benedict passes away. Like some of the the Benevacantist current might lump themselves in with the Sedes after that point. But I think there's probably for some time going to be a continued hypocrisy or a continued doublethink in the behavior of, for example, parish priests who pray in the Eucharistic prayer for unity with someone they don't believe is Pope. I think you're going to see increasingly flagrant hypocrisy and doublethink around that, and I think at some point I have to believe that the cognitive dissonance is just going to be too much to stand. I don't see how you can go on indefinitely saying things like, together with Francis our Pope and such our Bishop. It's like in the Episcopal Church, which I converted to Catholicism from, there was an issue that I had. I didn't have the whole laundry list of complaints about liberal Christian moral theology or whatever that a lot of converts from mainline Protestantism to Catholicism have, but I was concerned that these were people who, as I like to put it, priests in these denominations couldn't get through the Nicene Creed without crossing their fingers. I'm concerned that we'll end up with a Catholicism in which there's a significant portion of priests who cannot get through the Eucharistic prayer without crossing their fingers.
Right. Well, and I'm sorry this turned out to be a lot more intense conversation. I was hoping to talk about Paul VI earlobes and Frank Sinatra being the being
Pope
you
Francis
know his
being like a thawed out bionic Frank Sinatra. Yeah. David was saying he thinks that I mentioned that in one of my essays. David was saying he thinks that was like one QAnon person who tried to make that a thing, but even the other QAnon people weren't having it.
yeah. Yeah. So David, to close us out, I'm curious, where do you think this is headed? How low do you think this will go? The next question is, do you think at some point Pope Francis will take action against this erupting schism? And I don't think anyone can really deny it. And what do you think is the way out?
Well, yeah, I mean, those are huge questions, and I actually I agree with Nathan that I don't see this easing off or slowing down in any way, because I mean, if you look at the people who have kind of gone on this path, the sort of anti-Francis path, no one's come back from it. It seems no one's kind of gone, you know, this far and then taken a few steps back, or it doesn't seem to be that way. People just keep going further and further and further and more extreme. And I think it's because, it's very difficult to, even if you think, maybe I'm going in the wrong direction here, you have to look back and say, well, then I was wrong about all those things that I said about Pope Francis. I'm wrong about all these things that I said about Vatican II. I'll have to make like a kind of apology. It's very, very difficult for people to do that. It's painful. And it's much easier to then to instead double down and reinforce those existing beliefs once again and get even more extreme.
I actually want to interrupt you there because some of our readers actually have come back from that brink. And that's really who we're there for people who are, well, people who love the Pope and want to learn more about him and help promote his mission and vision. But a lot of people who are surrounded with this line of thinking stumble across our site, or they're looking for something different. And fortunately, our work has been there, and I'm grateful to you guys for being part of this important service. So I just wanted to stop you there because there are individual cases, but it's certainly not the overall trend.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with that. And I've, by contributing to Where Peter Is, I've come into contact with people, a good number of people who have told me those same kinds of things. Like they were really leaning towards believing the things that Taylor Marshall had to say and those kind of public figures. But now thanks to Where Peter Is, they've kind of come to their senses, and I think that's a huge part of the mission, yeah, of Where Peter Is, and I think it's such a blessing that it exists for that reason, and I'm proud to be a contributor to it for that reason. I guess I'm thinking more about the sort of public figures who have been the sort of leaders, the big voices, and I think it's especially hard for them to admit that they're wrong because they've got an audience. They've got some of them. This is pulling in a lot of money for them, and to turn around and kind of back off some of those things they were saying before, that's going to earn them a lot of criticism. They're going to lose followers. They're going to lose that income stream. And so again, you can only kind of maintain that momentum by getting more and more extreme. And I think, unfortunately, they're going to take some people with them, but hopefully many people will come to their senses in the meantime. And I think Pope Francis, it may be that he doesn't quite realize the severity of the situation, but I like to think anyway that he does, and that he's letting this play out because he knows that it's necessary for the church. I think he really wanted to create this open missionary church that goes out to people, not a church that's defensive, that has enemies that it's has to fight all the time, right? That's not his way of thinking. And so even to discipline someone like Viganò or Cardinal Burke, someone like that would be like drawing that line and making them the enemy, and then you've got a battle that he's got to deal with. I don't think he wants to fall into playing that game. And this idea of the enemy, it seems like for a long time there's been people in the church, and I think this is just part of human nature too. They need this enemy to fight, and the church at times in history has been very defensive, has been kind of on guard against all of the forces trying to destroy it, and so there's a nostalgia for that time. But that's not what we need right now. For a while, I think, if you look at the apocalyptic Marian stuff that I've been going through, I was surprised at, how much of it is connected to anti-communism. It was part of that sort of apocalyptic Cold War narrative. And I think that was part of the great appeal, is that they set up Russia and they set up the communist empire as the great enemy of the church, the great foe that we have to conquer. Even through the John Paul II era, that was still part of the narrative, because he was the guy who was helping to take down communism, and he did in a way. But after that, I think people were a little lost, because it seemed like after the fall of communism, there wasn't this enemy to fight. So they tried to figure out new enemies. So they look to the New World Order, they look to liberalism in general, or they might try to want to reinvigorate the Cold War. Like people who really, there's so much criticism of the Vatican-China agreement, because I think people would love to see China as the great atheist empire that the church has to battle, right? But again, Pope Francis doesn't see things that way. I don't think the church is thinking that way, that we have to always be engaging in these sort of existential battles, that more can be accomplished through openness and dialogue. And again, these are kind of boring sounding things, but they can actually, when you get into them, they can be the most fruitful, amazing things. But again, just superficially, they don't have that crusader edge to them that a lot of people are looking for, right? So I think there's going to be a purging of the church of that mentality that we need to be always fighting against the enemy, because conspiracy theory is that it's an attempt to create an enemy that's at your door, that's in your institutions, that wants to subvert everything that's good, and you're the only one who can fight it. You're on the side of light versus darkness, that sort of thing. We've got to get that mentality out of the church to create a more, again, it's not that we're trying to say that, and I certainly don't think that Pope Francis believes that evil doesn't exist. Evil certainly exists. The devil certainly exists, but it's all very much more complicated than black versus white Viganòite mentality would allow for. So I think this is almost going to be a really painful purging, but I think it's necessary. And my only thing is I just hope it doesn't bring down too many people with it. Because, again, it's ordinary people in the pews who I think, we probably care the most about, especially at where Peter is.
And that's, I guess, the thing that's the most heartbreaking, to be a North American Catholic and to see this happening to people, friends, family, people we know, people in our congregations. There are going to be losses by this strategy, and I guess that's the thing. That's why I keep thinking I wish Francis would. There's a part of me that says I wish Francis would just excommunicate these people and prove that what they're doing is operating outside what the church is actually doing. But I think we've gone on for a significant amount of time. So thank you, Nathan and David, for a very fascinating conversation. Just keep fighting the good fight. I one thing that popped into my head when we were talking about potential solutions is we need great saints. We need not just effective leaders, but we need true witnesses and true evangelizers, especially in this country. And God will provide the church what it needs. That's something Phyllis Viganò said when I interviewed her a couple of months ago. So yeah, I mean, let's continue to pray for our church, pray for Viganò and all those who are following him. Pray for Mr. Q, whoever that is. Let's keep our eyes fixed on Christ and try to stay close to his church. So thank you, Nathan, David, and everyone listening. Until next time, take care.